I do invite you to continue enjoying your desserts and coffee. I'd like to ask you as well, at some point this evening, to take a look at this program brochure. Especially look at the long list of people who've supported our dinner tonight. We're very grateful for them. With your help, we have a record attendance tonight. More than 1,000 people. So thank you very much. Now, an evening of this magnitude has a million moving parts, and when you add the complication of government public servants, 2 million moving parts, it's obviously involved lots and lots of extra efforts on the part of many people, especially on the Acton staff. So I'm really grateful to you for your excellence, and I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our staff for their extra efforts. And I know they're busy clearing, but I'd also like to thank the servers here at DeVos Place who've done an exceptional job. It's always dangerous to try to recognize individuals in the room, and there are many people I would like to call out individually, but I'm not that brave to begin the attempt. However, I think it would be appropriate to acknowledge a couple people, especially in the room, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that we have 7 college presidents, past and current, in the room. And if you would put a slide on the, there we go, and I'd ask them to stand and be recognized. Thank you for being here, and I'm sorry that Betsy DeVos couldn't see you here to support her. I'm sure it'd be very meaningful. I will certainly let her office know. And one final set of people I'd like to acknowledge are the students in the room. After all, we are here to celebrate opportunities for you. And I know there are a number of them. If you happen to be a student, high school or college, please stand. All right? Now, everybody from West Michigan knows there's freedom in the water in Holland, Michigan. Tonight, we have more than 3 full tables of Hope College students. And that's enough to give anyone hope in our future. Okay. Sorry, I had to do it. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce a man already known to most everybody in this room, a remarkable priest, entrepreneur, public intellectual. His gifts include a brilliant mind, a compassionate heart, and a huge dose of courage, both personal and intellectual. And I'm speaking, of course, of my colleague, Father Robert Sirico. And an evening with Acton wouldn't be complete without hearing from him. So please join me in welcoming Father Robert Sirico.
Thank you. Please. I think Betsy DeVos is the best Secretary of Education that this country has ever seen. She's certainly the best dressed Secretary of Education. And let us all pray that she is the last. You get the point. Betsy had to leave us because of a family emergency, and really in a way, and you'll know probably, sadly enough, more about that in the next few days, but it underscores the practice that we have been preaching. I mean, you heard in the prepared remarks, you read it in the Acton Institute literature over and over again about the primacy of the family. And her presence tonight with us, interrupted by a family emergency, indicates what her priority is, what your priority is. And all of this really goes to the core of what the Acton Institute is and always has been about. And that is the dignity of every single human life. Unrepeatable. Think about that. You and I will never be repeated. We're all unique. God created us with a particular purpose. And that purpose needs to be fulfilled by us. And when it's not, when we choose not to fulfill His purpose in our lives, or when we are obstructed from fulfilling His purpose in our lives, that's a tragedy of monumental proportions. We began, Chris and I can't believe it's 27 years ago now, except when I look at the old photos and see how less gray Chris was. And I must confess to you that I am at least responsible for part of those gray hairs. Because, he trembles. There are no notes on this platform, and I'm not reading. We have this on? There we go. I'm not reading from a teleprompter. So now, when you see Chris at the end of the evening, the head will be completely white. We are here because of an idea. And it was very difficult 27 years ago in 1990 when we began the work of the Institute. It was very difficult to go to people and say, oh, we have this great idea. What we want to do is educate seminarians about economics, and we want to help business people understand the moral dimensions of their enterprise. Oh, yeah. How much did you want that check for? And yet, look at this. Because there is a sufficient number of people who understand how critical that synthesis is, you understand that it's necessary to have a free society, because if you don't have a free society, you don't have anything else. If you don't have the right to private property, if you don't have the right to govern your family, then you don't have anything. Whatever you want to call that construct, whatever you want to call that system that you live under, if you can't control what you have produced, if you can't live in your family based on the choices that you make for your kids and for your own lives, then whatever you call that system, it is certainly not a free society. So it's necessary to have that. But the other part of this is that freedom isn't enough. That we all know that while it is built into our nature to be free, it is also built into our nature to be virtuous. And when we fail in virtue, as we all do, on a regular basis, and as St. Paul said, of whom I am the chief, we fail in our vocation. We fail in our potential. We fail in the excellence to which God has called each and every one of us. And it's almost as though, and we saw this 27 years ago when we began this, actually longer than that, because we were thinking about it for a good long time. But we saw that there was this almost dichotomy, a separation, a barrier between this notion of economics, of liberty, of efficiency, of all of these kinds of questions having to do with the here and the now and the material world and how to allocate scarce resources, and this life of virtue, because a lot of people think the life of virtue is ethereal and disembodied and spiritual and up there somewhere. And the economists are down here somewhere, right in the weeds. And they're coming up with econometric designs and mathematical equations. And our passion was and remains to bring these two worlds together. Why? It had to do with a little video that you saw. It had to do with what Secretary DeVos alluded to. It's the human person. It's understanding the dignity of the human person, understanding who we are. And what are we? We're physical, obviously. I think we've all just become a little more physical tonight. You finished your dessert? If you haven't finished it, you'll be more physical by the end of the evening. We're corporeal, but we're also transcendent. There's something more to us than our physicality. It's this awareness that there's something more to us than a good meal or a good bottle of wine or a profitable quarter. That's important. That's necessary. You don't have the profitable quarter, you don't have the good bottle of wine, you don't have the good meal, right? Everybody cares about the poor, and some of them, like the people outside tonight, want to make so many more programs for the poor that they will ensure that they have more poor people. But when you understand this process of discovery, of creativity, of excellence, and then when you bring to bear on that this transcendent vision of who human beings are in their fullness, in their totality, that we are called to something beyond this physical world, then you understand the compatibility and the kind of interpenetration of these two worlds. That economic decisions are important decisions, but they only become great decisions, good decisions, moral decisions, when they're informed by our nature and our destiny. That's the key to what the Acton Institute is about. I can't tell you how many times over the years when we've gone to people and asked for their support, as we visited many of you, I know, over the years, thank you. So many of you have said, I just love what you're doing. What is it you're doing? Now, let me tell you something, why that is a reality. That's a reality, and it really underscores why the Institute was necessary. Because you know what you're doing. You know these two worlds, but a lot of you didn't have a vocabulary to express it, or you had a truncated vocabulary, so you expressed it in terms of utility and profit-making and all of the rest of it. Or you expressed it on the theological side in terms of, you know, spirituality and virtue and transcendence. But when you bring the two of these together, this becomes very potent. Over the years, and some of you have heard me quote this ad nauseum, which, come to think of it, is Latin for the mess we're in, to quote the secretary, to quote Ronald Reagan. And that was the words of the French philosopher Etienne Gilson, who said that if you want to build a cathedral that represents the rising of the soul to God, that has a facade that reaches up to heaven, into the clouds, that represents our prayers and our aspirations and our best instincts, if you want to do that, to build a cathedral like that, you must first study geometry. And then he said, Piety is never a substitute for technique. Because without technique, piety is helpless to make use of nature for the glory of God. That should be on every seminary in the world. To understand that the technique of making a brewery or a bakery or a clothing manufacturer, or for that matter, a school, the technique that goes into that, balancing accounts, making sure you have the right people in the right places and managing all of that mundane stuff, mundane derived from the Latin word of the world, this daily stuff, is necessary to do good. It's not sufficient because you can do all of that and not do good. And Lord knows there are plenty of people who do it. My new friend AJ, who's another transport from New York, right? This is a good place. It's like a little big city. And you don't pay that much for parking. And you don't pay that much for a drink. I don't know, do you drink in your church? Because the Baptists, they don't drink. Excuse me, in front of other Baptists. But you know, these people who live in this bubble and think, well, I've got the solution to your problem, violate this common sense notion of what our lives are about, the mundaneness of our existence, which is where you and I discover God. We bring our talents, we bring our knowledge, we bring our intellect, we bring our risk, we bring our courage, we bring our heroism to bear on this material world, and we draw out from it what was already embedded in this world. Why? Because it was embedded in this world because God made the material world to begin with. And that's why piety is never a substitute for technique. To just be this embodied sense of, I don't know, religiosity, spirituality, all the rest of it, without incarnating it, there's a word, incarnating it, making it real to this world, then we leave the world as poor as it was. And that's, by the way, most of human history. But something exceptional happened roughly 200 years ago. I don't say it was because Americans invented it, but in a unique combination of ways, Americans discovered this. And they drew in this discovery from all over the world, of which we are all a part, right? Unless there is some American Indians amongst us. But we came from all over the world to this place, this sphere of sovereignty, to allude to Abraham Kuyper, this space of freedom to apply our inventiveness and our creativity and our risk and our investment and our future. And each of us, whether we're Dutch or Italian or French or German or whatever, can tell the stories of our families, of people who came here, sometimes in desperate need, who just applied their intelligence in the context of freedom. And for the longest period of time did this with a great sense of responsibility and virtue. Now today we're confronted with a unique set of challenges because people have come to take for granted human liberty. That's very, very dangerous. When you think you can just live off of the legacy of the past, that you can just cash in on some bottomless checkbook without knowing how the resources got there in the first place. When you do that, it's very dangerous. And we have a precarious situation in our country and indeed in our world right now where people think that they can do that. Acton stands against this dichotomy. It stands against this falsification of reality. It stands in favor of the incarnation. That in the same way as God became man, so the creation of the world, as we learn in the book of Genesis, was the act of God who breathed into a physical lump of clay the breath of life, and then gave that human family a vocation to be creative and productive and procreative in our world. You know, 40 or more years ago, I would have been out on that street protesting. Mea maxima culpa. And I know, perhaps maybe better than anybody in this room, how depressing it was to have a dozen. There were dozens out there. That's what the media will say. There were dozens. I told somebody tonight, I remember a protest I was involved with, and there were 3 of us. I went home very depressed that night. And I hope the same for them. And no, but I hope more than that. I hope more than that. I hope that they come to the realization that I came to, that good intentions aren't enough. That if you love the poor, if you're concerned about the hungry, learn how to make a bakery. Learn how to build a business. You know, I've followed, of course, the assaults on Secretary DeVos all over the country, and one of the repetitive themes is education for profit. What's wrong with profit? Think of its opposite. It's called loss. Oh, yes. That's the educational system in much of this country. And if West Michigan is exempt from that, it is only so temporarily. Because to the extent that it follows that logic, it will all happen. Nobody, I mean, do people say, you know, people are making money off of people's nakedness? It's called the textile industry. They're making money off of your hunger tonight by making food and selling it to you. What's wrong? I get it that education's purpose is not to make a profit. But if you accomplish the purpose of education, which is the education of children, then wouldn't you want to pay people who are doing that for you because they have studied, they have given their lives, the teachers, these noble teachers, both inside the public school system and especially inside the private school system, who live at a much lower salary level. Wouldn't you want to pay them? And how could you do that without making a profit? You see, because piety is never a substitute for technique. Just even having the pious thought of educating kids without having the technique of how to build an institution that can do that is one example of what we've been saying from the beginning of the Acton Institute. Now, we stand opposed to the divisiveness we see in our country. I love a debate. I really do. I'm from New York. I love a debate. Every Sunday afternoon at our table, we had debates. But we've lost this sense of how to really disagree without being disagreeable. And I think in a real way, a lot of this divisiveness in our country has come from a subliminal acceptance of the Marxist notion of the inevitability of class struggle, that there have to be these intrinsic hostilities between people, between educators and families, or between the laborer and the owner of capital, or between man and the environment, or between absurdity of absurdities, man and woman. We stand against this notion of class struggle and class warfare, class division, where society always has to have these antagonisms and that this is what's going to promote progress. In society, it doesn't. And we have a bloody history of a century of examples of where that doesn't work. No, what we do is we stand and speak about harmonies, economic harmonies, where supply and demand have to go together, where the owner of the means of production depends upon the worker, where the consumer is served by the entrepreneur. Economic harmonies, not economic conflicts and divisions and class struggle. And no one ever said it better than a little Albanian nun who ended up in India, who was canonized a year or so ago. Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She was no economist. I doubt she ever read Das Kapital. I was at the airport the other day, and the fellow who was giving me my ticket for my car, he had this big, thick volume of Das Kapital sitting there. And I looked at it, and he looked at me, and I said, "Are you reading that?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, if I might borrow a quote from Mark Twain, not an application of that book, but elsewhere, that's chloroform in print." Oh, he said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "Have you read it? Are you reading it? Are you sleeping well?" And this little Albanian nun put it so well. I just want to leave you with her observation, and you tell me that she didn't have it down. She said, we don't have any right to condemn the rich. We don't believe in class struggle and in class warfare. We believe in class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.